Hello and welcome to African Perspectives on Colonial Violence and Memory, where we interview scholars from the EPICUR region about their perspectives on memorial culture in their home countries and in the region. We are students from the Albert-Ludwig University in Freiburg studying history. This podcast is a production sponsored by the EPICUR program and the International Office, and part of a seminar on colonial violence and remembrance led by Dr. Susanne Kuß. Freiburg University is part of the EPICUR region, which includes the universities of Basel, Strasbourg, Karlsruhe and Haute-Alsace. The program promotes cooperation between the universities and stipends seminars and projects that promote interregional cooperation. Thank you and welcome to Dr. Henri-Michel Yéré for being an interview partner and talking about colonial violence and memory in his home country, Côte d'Ivoire, the EPICUR region, and his view on the state of memory globally. Dr. Yéré is a lecturer and researcher at the Center of Africa Studies at Basel University with a focus on contemporary history. He studied in France, South Africa and Switzerland, where he currently lives with his wife and 3 children. Dr. Yéré is the author of 3 collections of poems, 2 of them published in 2015 called 1990 and La nuit était notre seule arme, and one published in 2023 called Polo Kuman, Polo Parle. The interview was done by Louise Schneider.
So thank you very much, Henri-Michel Yéré, for taking the time to do this interview with us today. And I think that would just allow us to directly dive into the questions. Maybe the first one is going to be the most difficult one. How would you characterize the culture of memory in the Côte d'Ivoire in 2 or 3 sentences?
The culture of memory, you mean to say how people remember their past?
Yes.
You see, it's interesting because according to the type of political government you have, people talk of regime often when they speak of governments in Africa. According to the type of regime that you have a differentiated approach to the notion of memory. So, for example, in 2000, for the first time, you had a different party than the party that had led the country to independence take over the government. And that party was an opposition party at the time, left-wing in its orientation. And so they brought forward the names of figures that were described as having resisted colonial penetration. And in that way, you actually had in public discourse names of people that you hadn't really heard before, or that you had heard of, but that weren't spoken of so loudly before. The party before them that was in power, as I said, had led the country to independence in 1960. And when you looked around the city of Abidjan, which is the main city of the country, you can still see some of the main thoroughfares and streets and boulevards and avenues carry the names of French colonial either administrators or military rulers. And so that tells you something about the ways in which the government at that time saw itself in relationship to the memory of colonization, not so much as a power that stood against it, but as a power that understood its role somehow as a continuator of the colonial state without ever claiming it publicly, obviously. Those are subtle readings that enabled observers to come to that conclusion. And then today, since 2011, you have another regime in power, the government of President Ouattara. And there you have another way of remembering, which is closely associated to the ways in which the party that rules the country now saw itself in relation to its supporters. The ruling party now is a party that was created on the basis of the notion that some parts of the population were being persecuted for their origin, so the northerners in the country were being persecuted for their origin, for the fact that there were Muslims from the north. I mean, I'm speaking like they speak. I'm not saying that I agree with it. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to give you a sense of how they understand themselves. And they're coming to power took place in very violent conditions after a war that followed an election in 2010, 2011. And so there is a way of remembering people who died during that war, but a very segmented way of remembering these people. So it's their people who died that are being remembered rather than the entirety of the nation, because everybody in every camp lost people, obviously. To the extent that it went very far, because the former president then was actually sent to The Hague and sat in the International Criminal Court. So for a number of years, there was a very rife understanding of public memory, because a part of the country felt that they were being accused of being responsible of what had happened during the war. And another part of the country said, well, we won the war, therefore we dictate the terms of how we're going to organize the way we're going to remember these things. So not a peaceful thing, not a peaceful topic. The remembrance, be it of the colonial times, be it of the political tensions in the country, indeed.
So would you say that remembrance is mostly centered around individual figures, so that there's a form of heroism in these different periods that you described?
Yes and no. I mean, it depends on the types of events that you put forward. You see, when, for example, you think about the time when the countries in West Africa or in Africa in general were being conquered by European nations and turned into colonies, it's not like there was nothing before. So you did have kings and queens and chiefs, etc., who opposed, for all sorts of reasons, the coming of the Europeans. When the history of the actions of these rulers, these leaders, was written, it was presented as acts of resistance. But if you actually look closely, you realize that the way, if you're going to talk of acts of resistance, you're actually giving a particular twist to a story that can be more complex than that. If I take the example of the great figure of Samori Touré, for example, Samori Touré saw the French as one part of a very complex equation of power in West Africa. He did not understand necessarily that the French had the intention of coming in to stay. And so he operated with them the way he operated with his other adversaries in the region.
One as a rival that would come and go as others had before.
In a way. And only these rivals had incredible technological power. But even then, Samori Touré had found a way through his smiths to reproduce the weapons of the Europeans. So there was some type of rivalry that you could speak of. There was some technology transfer that you could speak of, but that was broken, of course, once the French arrested him in 1898 and deported him, to a faraway place in Gabon, on an island off the coast of Gabon, where he died a few years later. So that individual figure that I've just cited is one example. But if you remember, if I'm taking still Côte d'Ivoire, if you remember, there was an event that is extremely important in I would say even the national mythology of Côte d'Ivoire, is the Women's March of 1949. So in 1949, the colonial repression was very rife. The Cold War had just started. And RDA, which was the African Democratic Rally, Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, which was the leading anti-colonial movement at the time, had very clear ties to the Communist Party in France. And so the French government was really worried about these ties and wanted to break that connection with the communist movement. And so they decided to fight this movement very strongly, and they arrested the leadership of RDA in Côte d'Ivoire and sent them to prison, mostly men. And the wives of these men decided to march in front of the prison to ask for the release of their husbands, and they were met with the colonial forces who tried to break the march. And they acquired an incredible status as figures of resistance, as fighting spirits, as courageous women. And so this is a collective remembrance. There are some figures that emerge, obviously the figure of Marie Corée, for example, the figure of Anne-Marie Ragy, for example, etc. you remember it as the Women's March, not so much as you don't refer to this march in naming people individually. So depending on the event, you have a certain type of relationship to it that may attach itself to individual figures or to groups of people. Or, to add another example, in 1990, when the youth took to the streets of Abidjan, the students and the school students, the university students, you have some leadership figures that emerge, but it's mostly remembered as a collective movement indeed.
Thank you. Okay, we've talked about individual and collective memory, maybe about the everyday life in the Ivory Coast that you have experienced during your lifetime, your growing up, and maybe now also. How do you feel about the memory of colonialism and how it is present in this everyday life?
Well, the thing is this. There's been a very strong reassessment of that particular memory. And that happened at the time when, during the presidency of Laurent Gbagbo, between the year 2000 and 2011. And the reason for this is that there was a war that started after 2002 when a part of the army rebelled and tried to overthrow the president. And when that did not work, the French intervened in order to sort of try and secure the peace. But their intervention was seen as very suspect by the camp of the president. And that suspicion transformed into an actual full-blown hostility in 2004 when the aviation of the Ivorian military tried to bomb the rebellion and ended up bombing a French camp. And the French retaliated by destroying the fleet, the Ivorian fleet. And when the people were made aware of this, I'm giving you the story because it's important to understand. When they tried, people sort of revolted and then started to go after French interests in Côte d'Ivoire. France is one of the main economic partners of the country. Until 2004, you had a very important French community living in Côte d'Ivoire. And after that event, most of them left. And the French military, they had a base in Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan, sent their troops out around the Hôtel Ivoire, which is one of the main hotels in the city of Abidjan, surrounded the residency of the president. And when the demonstrators went against them, they shot the demonstrators. They killed over 60 people. Yeah. And so, these are facts that are not commented very widely in Europe. November 2004. So this to me was a breaking point in terms of the way people remember or relate to the colonial sort of memory, because France had appeared as a partner and suddenly it became an opponent, or at least it chose a camp in the war at the time. And so that event brought about a very strong reassessment of the relationship to France and to colonial memory. The Ivory Coast had, from 1951 right up to that date, 2004, had been seen in West Africa as France's main partner, maybe even more so than Senegal. And suddenly in 2004, the French government gives the order of destroying the air fleet of the Ivorian army, accusing the Ivorian military of having killed French soldiers by bombing them. And so that has brought about a break. And at least a part of the population can no longer regard the French as simple partners, but see them as people that have never actually renounced the prestige, power, and preeminence that has been their normal state of being since the colonial days, right? Other parts of the population don't necessarily feel this way. They feel rather that the French are an ally. Because you see, what has become the dividing point, one of the dividing points in African politics is your relationship to France. So if you think that France are partners, etc., you're rather on the conservative camp of the political spectrum. If you're critical of France's presence in the country, you're rather on the progressive side of the political spectrum, the right wing and the left wing, if I were to give equivalents. And so it has determined that sort of like the ways in which people see their understanding of of how to engage with the greater business of governing the country. So yeah, the war has really sort of allowed for a reassessment of that particular way of remembering the relationship. Because you see, France, although they are a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, which is not something that happens to a lot of countries, only 5 of them. Although it still has, through that, it still has some form of international presence that is undeniable, France is no longer the power that it used to be. But through their presence in Africa, they assert a certain type of clout in the world, which has been very heavily contested, not just in Côte d'Ivoire, but also if you observe in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Chad, even in Senegal, many people are now saying we no longer want that type of relationship. So in Côte d'Ivoire too, it manifests itself. But because the government in place right now is friendly to the French interest, it is not as visible as it would be in a place like Burkina Faso, where the government is openly hostile to that relationship.
So if we're talking about this more progressive leftist political spectrum, I'm guessing that that's where the colonial remembrance is most prominent, because they want to focus on the faults of the past or the happenings of the colonial time, while the right spectrum is rather neutral or
No, you shouldn't assume that when we say colonialism, we're talking about the past.
Yeah.
You see, because it's a practice rather than an event. It's an attitude rather than a closed sort of like fact that we can look back and, assess, discuss, the way you would say, for example, the Second World War in Europe. Because, if you go to Korea, the Second World War is all over.
Yes.
So the point I'm trying to make is that it's not so much looking at the past, because, when people look at the past, colonialism was a clear when you were officially in a situation of colonialism. Very few people can say this was good, because it was a clear denial of the sense of equality, of your humanity, of your dignity as a person. What I'm talking about now is a practice. And of course, my saying this would be shunned upon by a lot of people who would say, yeah, but you're dwelling on the past. And I'm saying, no, it's not a dwelling on anything. It's not a matter of the past isn't past. It's a matter of the practice which actually enables you to assume that you can invest in this part of the world and repatriate 100% of your profits. The practice which makes you assume that whenever you're in a situation of collaboration, you are going to teach the people how to do things right. The practice which makes you assume that no matter what, you hold the upper hand from a technological and industrial perspective, etc., etc., etc. That practice is embedded in the cradle of the colonial relationship. So it's really a matter of wondering when and how we as people are going to be able to take care of our own economic problems, for example. You should never forget the presence of the CFA franc, which is a currency that we use in many former French colonies, which is a very enduring symbol of the presence of France, because it's a currency that is pegged on the euro. And the reason for this is is that it was pegged on the French franc. So the currency that we use is a subdivision of the euro. So you need to also see these things. So it's not abstract stuff. Mm-hmm. It's not theory.
It's an active, ongoing practice.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So in that sense, one cannot say that people are dwelling on anything rather than they are being critical of a certain practice of power.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Being critical, remembering the time before the independence, is that, would you say, triggered by certain events or like political holidays in the daily, everyday life?
Well, National Day in many countries is the Day of Independence, right? So in Côte d'Ivoire, it's 7th August, for example. So obviously people will remember that if you go to a place like the Congo, you have 4th of January, which is the Day of the Martyrs, which is to commemorate a massacre committed by colonial forces against Congolese people demonstrating for their independence in 1959 on the 4th of January. So obviously you do have, many of these days. In Senegal, they were discussing recently the possibility of creating a day of remembrance around the massacre of Thiaroye, which is a story of a tirailleurs sénégalais, so war veterans from West Africa. They were called Senegalais, but they were from all over West Africa, who were clamoring for their retribution, their financial retribution to be paid to them, and the French, instead of paying them, sort of grouped them in a camp and one night surprised them with machine guns and killed them. To this day, we can't tell you the number of people that were killed that day. Some people speak of 50, some people speak of 400. Mm-hmm. So it was recently recognized by the French. When I say recently, I'm talking about last year, December. So a few months ago. It was officially acknowledged. And so I'm trying to bring all of these things up so you understand. So, for example, the French, the Senegalese are talking of maybe turning this day into a public holiday to remember that event. You have... So those events really, but a lot of public holidays too in our countries are religiously bound. So Christian and Muslim public holidays, for example, are celebrated. But the National Day is often the day of, the proclamation of independence, which does not actually mean that it was the day when independence came. Because in many cases, people feel that independence hasn't come as such. Mm. So, yeah.
And would you say there are also places that trigger remembrance?
Yes, of course. I mean, the example I just gave you in Senegal, so the military camp of Thiaroye, for example.
And in Côte d'Ivoire?
In Côte d'Ivoire, I mean, you would have, you have a monument to the dead of the Second World War, which is in the district of Plateau, which is the neighborhood of, the business neighborhood, the CBD, as one says in urbanism, the central business district. You have places that are connected. You see, again, the different regimes come into play. You have places that are connected to some massacres that took place in the past few years, not necessarily bound to the colonial events, but, in front of Hôtel Ivoire, for example, it's a Place des Martyrs, where the French killed the demonstrators in 2004. I was talking to you about it earlier. Grand Bassam, of course, has a monument in the memory of the women that demonstrated in 1949.
The Women's March.
Yes, exactly. So, Grand Bassam was historically the first capital city of the country when the French came. So it's a city that has some sort of symbolic capital in the memory of the Ivorian nation. And there are names of places that are remembered. For example, in the follow-up of the March 1949, you had a massacre that was committed by the French colonial troops in a city called Dimboko in the center of the country. So when you say Dimboko, people remember that. They remember what happened there in 1950. I mean, recently a poet, Placide Conan, published a book, and the title of the book is 1950, which is the year 1950, the year when this happened. And in the poem, he has a person that was killed speak. That's the power of poetry. To bring back the dead, for them to speak to the living. Yeah. So I'm bringing this up because, I also published a book called 1990, which is a remembrance of the year 1990, which was a big political shift when multi-party politics was reinstated after 30 years of one-party state governance. Why am I bringing this up? Is because I feel that writers, poets in particular, but also novelists, by writing books about these events, also create spaces for these events to be discussed, to be engaged with, to be reflected upon. It doesn't necessarily need to be physical spaces, but it can also be stories. And so that content is also not to be frowned upon.
Yes. Okay, maybe one last question on the practice of remembrance. I mean, you kind of hinted on it, that there is collective memory, but it's greatly varied over where politically you stand. And how does that affect people personally? Do you think that people feel the need to position themselves?
Yeah, I feel that what it does is that we don't tell the same story. You know, when people recount the history of their country, they don't tell the same story. And on the one hand, it's a good thing, because that's a condition for the democratic debate, that we can tell different stories without having to shoot each other about it. That's freedom of expression at its essence, right? And people can come and say, well, in 1999, the army took power, and that was a military coup. And then some other people say, no. The army took power on behalf of a politician, and it is the reason why the country never found stability again. And some other would come and say, no, it's not the army that took over. It's those who were in power that lost the power because they lost the confidence of the people. So it is important that there are a multiplicity of stories, of recountings. At the same time, what is even more important is a guarantee that the carriers of these different narratives be free to express those differentiated views in the public spaces without those who hold power feeling threatened by the existence of a diversity of narratives over the fate of the nation. That is not always the case, because your understanding of the story of the nation has implications on your relationship to those who govern the country, on your relationship to those who decide how to allocate resources. To what extent are they happy accepting that people that have dissenting views still should benefit from resources allocated by their government? Yes. It's a question. That, to me, this is another way of asking the question of the democratic debate.
Okay, maybe we can move on to the second topic area of contents of memory. I mean, you already mentioned that poetry, for example, can be maybe defined as such an object of memory that symbolizes, or that can be in contact or can translate a sense of colonial remembrance. Mm-hmm. Would you be able to mention other objects that carry memories in that sense?
You know, you see something that happens in the country right now, which may not appear political in the first place, but let me tell you what it is. When people get married, so of course, you know, they like to invite their friends and have parties and spend money and show, you know, that they can marry big, etc. But to me, one thing that strikes me is that more and more in wedding ceremonies, people go either to the mayor, or they first go to the mayor because it has to be officially registered. If they have a particular religious inclination, they go either to church or to the mosque. But one thing that they do is that they dress traditionally. They wear the traditional garments. If they come from different regions of the country, they will wear the garments of the bride and then the garments of the region of the groom. And what am I trying to say by this? It is, to me, some sort of re-engagement with what we imagine tradition is. You know, tradition is always an invention of the present. That's the one thing. And the second thing is there's a very strong trend towards urbanization in the Ivorian life, just as there is a very strong trend towards urbanization in Africa and in the world. I mean, an oft forgotten historical fact of prime importance is that since 2008, for the first time in human history, the majority of human beings live in cities as opposed to the countryside. It's the first time in the entire human history that it happens. So what you see there, to me, is that the more you have that pull towards city life, urban life, not just through the settlement, but through also your imagination. What do you want for you and for your children? What is your goal in life, right? Where do you see yourself? The more you also have a longing for what you feel you're leaving behind. Sehnsucht. I think the German word is even stronger there than the English one. No, it's true. Right. We agree. And so I find that there's a lot of that, and it manifests in that way as far as I'm concerned, where you have younger people of a generation. People get married fairly young all over the world where you go. So you have in this younger generation people that want to assert their remembering what it means to be an African, to be of a particular ethnicity, to speak a particular language, or to have a particular regional practice, a certain sense of pride in a specific practice. And I find that this has to be cited, because to me social facts of that nature are highly political, of course, because they tell you something about the what I call the political imagination, spaces where your mind goes, the boundaries that your spirit defines, and how you relate to your present. Yeah, so to me, that's a way of understanding how people understand themselves in this day and age. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did. When you mentioned traditions or the Sehnsucht, is that a longing for African identity that's definitely pre-colonial, did you say?
Pre-colonial is an invention. Okay. It's not a notion. Because, the assumption that, sure, colonialism really did change a lot of things in Africa. But the assumption that it is like the most important element in African history is just an exaggeration, It's very important. It's not the most important thing. That's the first thing. The second thing is, again, when I mean that tradition is an invention, it's not theory. We don't remember much. Most of us do not know who our great-grandparents were. Not because we don't like them, not because we're not proud of where we come from, but we just don't remember them. You see what I'm trying to say? So for these reasons, what we call tradition are often acts of invention and reinvention. And what I mean to say by this is that we establish particular relationships to figures of tradition. I remember as a child, one of my dear uncles, who sadly passed away early in life, used to take us to the village where he grew up to attend a series of festivals that were rooted in the tradition, where you had masks, figures that would appear and perform dances and display powers that were seen as not quite natural. And it was very important to him that we, the children, be made aware of the existence of these things. And it also, I remember, allowed me to realize the connections that existed between different ethnic groups, because some of the masks that I saw dance at these ceremonies were also seen dancing in other parts of the country that I had not thought were related to one another before. You see, those masks that you saw dance, had elements in the way they were put that were borrowings from things that were modern installments. So, they would carry sort of like some types of sticks, or they would carry things on their heads that were, that they had borrowed from a mechanic, for example. So what I'm trying to say is that this idea that there is some quote unquote pre-colonial purity that one can relate to, and then a post-colonial dystopia of sorts should not be exaggerated. And the relationships that we have to what we call tradition are wholly dependent on how we experience our present and the emotional energy that we invest. You see it with religion. I mean, can you believe that we're living in a religious revival? Even in Europe, people walk around with their heads covered, scarves. People walk around with crosses. You see it. It's a revival.
We can see it in the US.
Exactly. And people reinvent their relationship. They say, because I'm a Muslim woman, I need to cover my head. But myself who's speaking to you here, I'm the son of a Muslim woman. My mother only ever covered her head after she went to Mecca. It's a very different practice of Islam. Right. So I can tell you it's not necessary as a Muslim woman to cover your head. But if this is how people choose to interpret Islam today, that's fine with me. But the point I'm making is that it is because of our contemporary times that this interpretation is prevalent. You understand? So the relationship to tradition is a factor of the present times. That's really the point I'm trying to make. And so this also works for the ways in which people relate to their traditions in the Ivory Coast, because some of the, and maybe I'll conclude this question with this one. I mean, we have a very famous figure of a mosque in Côte d'Ivoire, which is called the Zaouli. The Zaouli is become a UNESCO heritage figure. I think it was 2 years ago. We were extremely proud of that fact. It's a virtuoso dancer mosque. You can go on the internet and see videos of the Zaouli. But I was very surprised to find out that the Zaouli was invented in 1950. 1950 is within the lifetime of my parents. I thought it was one of the oldest things ever. Do you understand? And we all are very proud of that mosque. It is part of, humankind's heritage now. You understand? It is an eminently traditional figure, but it's an eminently modern figure. You understand? So one has to be careful with that notion of tradition. That's,
Maybe we now do a little switch and go to the topic of colonial violence, the violence by the French military, the French colonial rule in the Ivory Coast. What kind of role does that play in memory?
Well, as we said earlier, the French colonial violence or French violence has been a topic that has been very freshly renewed in Ivorian memory. So you see, in 2010, we had a presidential election. It was one of the most important elections in Africa at the time. Even in the world, it was said to be the most expensive election in the world, apparently. Because it was an election that necessitated so much organization after the country had been divided in two by a war. It needed to reinstate the listing of the voters. We needed to make sure that everybody had identity documents, that all the parties were organized, and that the leaders were ready to participate in peaceful fashion, etc. The United Nations deployed troops, and etc., etc. And then we had 83% participation in the first round of that election. And in the second round, we had the two main candidates that arrived was the outgoing president Laurent Gbagbo and his main competitor Alassane Ouattara. In the second round, Ouattara was declared the winner by the head of the Electoral Commission, whereas Gbagbo was declared the winner by the head of the Constitutional Court. The United Nations came in and said Ouattara won, and the French said Ouattara won. And what Ouattara did, and Gbagbo said, well, the Constitutional Court is the last arbiter according to the constitution of our country, so I'm the real winner. And the so-called international community chose to side with Alassane Ouattara and gave an ultimatum to Gbagbo to release power, so to speak, and to leave.
Leave the country.
Yeah, or leave power one way or the other, which he did not do. So Ouattara and his supporters asked for the French to intervene. And the president of France at the time was Nicolas Sarkozy, and the French did. So the French army intervened to support one camp, and that camp eventually won the war and arrested Laurent Gbagbo. Officially, 3,000 people were killed. Unofficially, we think between 10 and 20,000 people died. So the fact that the French intervened in order to solve an electoral, matter in their former colony, to me says it all as far as colonial violence is concerned. That more than 50 years after you've officially made this country independent, you still find it okay to send your army to choose a side in a dispute in a country. And eventually, when they arrested Laurent Gbagbo, the French troops actually had to pull out and send the forces of the rebellion forward so that the cameras don't register the image of white soldiers capturing an African president. But it might as well have happened. So my point is, when we speak of colonial violence, we make it sound like it's such a past, it's long ago. Alassane Ouattara is still the president of Côte d'Ivoire. Laurent Gbagbo went to The Hague, sat trial, was found innocent, went home, and is still trying to compete for the presidential election this year, 2025, October. So the point I'm trying to make is that we unfortunately cannot afford to understand colonial violence as something past. Obviously, French, if you ask the French, you're going to say, but this isn't colonial. The government of Côte d'Ivoire asked us to come. If it had been Germany that had intervened, if it had been Norway, if it had been a country like this, I would have said, okay, you could look at it as an international intervention, United Nations sponsored, etc. But the very French. So you don't need to look to 1949, to 1950. You don't need to look to 1908, when Gouverneur Engoulevent took over as governor of the colony of Côte d'Ivoire and introduced what he called the pacification, which was one very brutal military campaign to assert French presence in the colony of Côte d'Ivoire back then. You don't need to, of course you have to. It's important. We're historians. We like to reflect upon these things. We want to understand the consequences of this violence on our daily practices, right? But you also can look to 15 years ago and still see it. Mm-hmm. Although it will never be recounted as such. The French media are never going to say this was a colonial intervention. They're going to say this was an intervention at the request of the government of Côte d'Ivoire. It's very real.
Yeah. Would you say, with it being real and being ongoing and being topical today, that the idea of memory or remembrance of colonialism or colonial violence in this specific case is just not a good frame in general? Because you would say that for something to be remembered or to be, you would need it to be finite, to be done, and then you can reflect on it. What would be a better word maybe than memory?
But is anything remembered finite? Mm-hmm. Because the fact that you remember something is very proof that it's still with you.
Yes.
That it's not over. In the sense that its effects still work in the present that you live through. So I wonder whether... I don't think the notion of colonial is misguided. Mm-hmm. Because it is a framework of the relationship. It's a relationship. It's a fraught relationship, but it's a relationship. When you have couples that have toxic relationships, it still is a relationship, only it's toxic. It's not pleasant. One party is being done things that are not right. It doesn't mean that we don't have the responsibility of pulling ourselves away from it. I'm not saying that we are the abused child who doesn't know how to run away from, the abusive parent. I'm talking like this because there's a very high awareness of this complicated reality. No, I feel that the word colonial is actually still useful because so long as we do not refer to it as such, then we're not addressing the space where everything started. And I think it's even more important to maintain that angle because one thing that I feel in Europe, people don't necessarily understand as much as they should, and really, I don't want to be preachy, moralizing, or anything like this, but I don't think European societies understand that they need to decolonize themselves. I don't think they actually understand that colonialism is a type of oppression that actually has after effects on oppressor and oppressed. This is what Frantz Fanon has observed. That's his discovery, so to speak. And so I do feel that it is important to maintain the discourse on that notion of colonialism, coloniality even, and to stress the fact that it's a mutual reality. It's not just something that has happened to people in Africa and in Latin America. It is something that happened to everybody involved in that relationship. That abuse happened to all of us. And it is highly important that people start to think about it in a responsible way. And what I mean to say by this is that they shake away the feeling of guilt, because it's paralyzing. It is not a feeling that allows you to think. And what we need is thinking, because we need to have conversations. We need to be able to have exchange in a way that is serene. Not necessarily peaceful, but serene. Because sometimes it can't be peaceful. And it has to be not peaceful in order for things to advance. So I do think the term colonial is actually appropriate, yes. It's not holding us in the past, It's not, you should move on. I would like to move on, for God's sake. Oh, how would I like to have moved on? But we cannot at this point in time.
Do you think we once will?
Mm-hmm. I think we will, but what I'm more afraid of is the conditions in which it will happen. Because, let me take an example. China. Let us remember that right up until the 18th century, China was a very powerful country. Highly developed, highly sophisticated, etc. And then China had a very serious descent, sort of slum, fell into some kind of chaos, and was, also dominated by a number of powers in the West, etc. Opium wars and all of these things. They were forced into, submitting their population to drug networks. I mean, think about it. And when they opposed it, they were fought against by the British. Anyway, and today, China is the second most powerful economy in the world. And it's not a military rise or anything like this, it's not warfare or anything like that. But it's not friendly. When you look at the relationship between China and Europe or China and the United States, it's not a friendly, warm relationship. But somehow the Chinese have managed to reassert themselves in the world. You understand what I'm saying by that? I think that African humanity will reassert itself, has already started to do so. But I would like for that reassertion to occur in a way that's going to be in a cordial sort of engagement with the rest of humankind, and not in a vindictive and angry and unfriendly relationship, because this could happen. It could happen. So to me, this is really what I try to think about, the conditions, upon which this is going to happen. It'll take time. It won't be easy, but yeah.
Memory of colonialism in Europe. You mentioned that Europe doesn't understand the need to decolonialize. How do you encounter that in Switzerland or in Germany maybe? How do you deal with how these countries remember colonialism?
Look, not everybody, people are not standing in denial. Let me be clear. It's not that people are denying things. To me, it's more people are not necessarily informed of the extent to which their countries were involved. I mean, Switzerland is waking up at the moment quite, not just slowly. I mean, last year, the exhibition started last year and ended at the beginning of this year, 25. There was an exhibition in Zurich at the Landesmuseum, so the National Museum of Switzerland. And the exhibition was simply called Colonial. Die koloniale Verflechtungen der Schweiz. So the colonial entanglements of Switzerland. And it was one of the most visited exhibitions in the history of that museum. What that tells me is that people want to know. People are willing to confront themselves to that reality because they discover that they simply were not informed, and they start to find answers to questions such as, but why are there so many foreigners here from the global south? Why are they all here? Why is it that they come to this country and they give us the sense that they have an understanding of our culture when we have very little understanding of theirs? It's not because they're kind people who want to integrate. This isn't why. The reason for this is because in their countries, somehow they were educated with a sense that what comes out of the Western European part of the world is important. It constitutes something in the hierarchy of culture. So they come to Europe and they actually understand Europe. Whereas people leave Europe and they go elsewhere and they have no idea of what they're going to.
Because there's no need, or there's no...
Almost.
Yeah.
Almost, exactly. So I find that people here are really willing to understand what they do not know about that part of their own history. And I think that's a fantastic thing, particularly for the younger generations. Because if the younger generations are sort of expose themselves to those realities, then they would have a different relationship to the world. I mean, it could go either way. It could be a rejection also by, saying, well, this is proof that we're better because we colonize everybody. Proof that we're better. I put this in inverted commas, of course. Or it could be, well, here's why the world is organized the way it is. And what is happening to us, our wealth, our safety, security, cannot be regarded as simply some miracle of our hard work. Our Protestant ethics is important, but it's not enough. There's something else that comes in addition to that. So I'm rather optimistic on that front, to be completely honest with you. Even though I feel it's still not where it ought to be, and there's work to be done there. We can engage organizations that are working in the field of development aid, for example. I'll be very happy if at Christmas time we stop seeing, poor Black people on posters, by NGOs that want to, earn money by that. I would be very happy if that stopped, if they could display different images of their work, not exploit the assumed misery of Africa and Africans.
Play Do They Know It's Christmas on the radio.
Exactly. Exactly. So, if that could change, if we could get to a point where this would no longer be regarded as normal and actually as insulting and degrading for the dignity of people, if we could get to a point where African governments would no longer be so dependent on international aid to the extent that they could engage in economic partnerships with conditions of transfer of technology, which would allow them to produce goods that would be paid at the right price, so that the banana won't cost 1 franc at the Migros anymore, but maybe the 10 francs that it's supposed to cost.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to give you a sense of the type of world that we could aspire to live in if we're going to actually respect the value of people's work. Because it's all of that we're talking about. It's not just about, having a good conscience and being kind to your Black friends. It's really about thinking about the structures of the world and how they are imbricated into one another. You see, it goes very far as I'm concerned. So those are some of the ideas that I think are important to take into consideration.
It's impressively positive an outlook.
I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying that's how that's a little bit my vision. If it should happen, what could happen? Yeah. There's a lot happening against that, especially at the moment, with all the tariffs going up and all the commercial wars that are taking place, etc. So
difficult times to stay optimistic, maybe.
Exactly.
Maybe we'll go away from Europe for a last time before coming to the topic of EPICUR and your employment also at an EPICUR university. So going back to Côte d'Ivoire and nation building, what role does memory play in the generation of group identities? Do the local traditions differ from the national ones? Or is that not to be detangled in such a way?
You see, the thing with ethnicity is that it's a political factor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we tend to tie ethnicity to tradition because we've learned that in anthropology. But actually, and a lot of anthropology also sees it very clearly that ethnicity has to be tied to the political factors in a given society. And why do I say this? Is because one of the big features of Ivorian politics over the past 30 years has been the repoliticization or politicization of ethnic identity. And so, again, you know, I'm coming back to this wartime because you see, that's the thing with wars. They modify the relationship that societies have with their own memory completely. I don't need to say that to you as Germans. And so in Côte d'Ivoire, I'm going to take you one example of what happened in the west of the country during the war in 2011. There's been, at the end of the month of March 2011, an incident, a very grave incident, a massacre of almost 800 people in a city of the west of Côte d'Ivoire called Djokwe. Djokwe is a home of the Wé people. And the Wé people are a people that live in the west of the country, which is a rather mountainous region, also a region where a lot of cocoa is exploited, cocoa being what Côte d'Ivoire sells the most in the world, right? A very precious product in the country. And the Wé were said to be people that supported Laurent Gbagbo. And so when the rebel army that was fighting for Ouattara came into that particular city, they actually started to look at people's ID cards. And if you were a Wé person, they would shoot you dead. 800 people in one day were killed. That has done something to the relationship that the Wé people have with the Malinké, which is a generic name referring to the ethnic group of northern Côte d'Ivoire, out of which Ouattara derives most of his support. That modifies ethnicity tremendously. Because the moment you feel that you were targeted because of your ethnicity, you feel that you were the victim of ethnic cleansing, of a type of genocidal violence at the hand of another group. And for that reason, you invest your ethnic identity with a political meaning that it did not have before. You see? And you have a similar feeling with the people who support the president, whereby when in 2000, Gbagbo became president, a few hours after he became president, a mass grave was discovered at the outskirts of Abidjan. And this mass grave was said to be a mass grave filled with the corpses of young Malinké men. Became known as the Charnier de Yopougon, the mass grave of Yopougon, Yopougon being a neighborhood at the outskirts of Abidjan, the biggest neighborhood of Abidjan. And out of that, the Malinké youth said, well, if this is true that this has happened, then it means that the people who support this president, Gbagbo, they want our death. So they are arch enemy. Even though a lot of people have contested that this actual mass grave was a mass grave filled with the corpses of Malinké people, there's been lots of controversies. What I'm trying to show you by connecting ethnic identity to the occurrence of massacres is that these identities are invested with a different meaning. This is what happened in the former Yugoslavia, where suddenly people started to feel Croatian, whereas before they were Yugoslavs, or Bosnian, whereas before they were Yugoslavs. Why? Because they were targeted as such, because they were killed for that reason. You understand? So the point I'm trying to make is that the strength of tradition falters in the face of the barrel of the gun when it comes to the manifestation of ethnic identity. And I wish it were different. I wish it were different. But so that fact has reinforced the notion that political leadership deploys itself along ethnic lines. So leaders, of course, they have ideas and societal projects and, programs. If I become president, I'll do this. If I become minister, I'll do that. If I become mayor, I'll do this, like everywhere in the world. But what it comes down to at the end of the day is, you are my people because we have a similar ethnicity. You cannot vote for anybody else but for me. And that is poisonous for any kind of national project. So this leads me to ask the question of knowing whether the national project in itself is an idea that we should pursue. There are different ways of being together. Is nation statehood the only way? But it's a difficult question to answer historically because we live in the era of the nation state. What we had known before was the imperial era. And the imperial era is an era that is dominated by conquest and warfare, by colonial dominion, etc., etc. So what is, and this is a question that I ask collectively to African nations, what is it that we can explore as ways of being together that differs from the national form, but which still guarantees the dignity of the people that live together without questioning the possibility of having a common future? I don't have the answer to that question. But I think it's a very important question to me, because I don't think that just following a particular historical trajectory without asking ourselves the reason as to why we're on that trajectory in itself constitutes an answer. I don't think so.
So, you are employed for some time now at Henri-Michel University here in Basel. How is the EPICUR section? How is EPICUR present in this program, in your teachings?
Well, we often get students from France or from Germany who come and take classes with us, actually quite regularly. And I find it refreshing because they bring perspectives that we're not necessarily used to. And they bring sort of a way of working together, which is maybe sometimes a little less, how can I put it, reserved. Because, I love the students from Basel, don't get me wrong. But some of our people here may be a little guarded when it comes to offering a perspective or sharing a view, etc. And maybe it is less the case in Germany and in France when it comes to being part of seminars and these kinds of things. So I appreciate it from that perspective, absolutely. Yeah, to have this sort of mixing.
And do you see influences of the EPICUR cooperation in your research, in your professional work, besides teaching?
Not as clearly. But it has happened, for example, that I've been asked to co-supervise students from, universities in France, on the basis of the EPICUR program, which is always very interesting. But in terms of actual research and things of that kind, I can't openly, or I can't obviously say that it's been very clearly an influence on the way I collaborated with colleagues.
Yes.
It's fine. It's not the end of the world. It's just a fact.
Do you have a vision of how the EPICUR program could be strengthened or improved?
I mean, obviously, if we had, we already have the credit point system that's been sort of, put together. We could imagine teaching classes together in terms of, things like 1 week in Freiburg, 1 week in Basel, but these are things that I don't, maybe it's happened, but I haven't seen it yet, but I would think that things like this could be actually very interesting,
But not easy, as we already discussed, with the semesters being so different with the dates. So
Exactly. No, not necessarily simple or block seminar or things of that kind. But I could imagine things like this. But yeah, a better coordination over the dates would be helpful.
Okay, so EPICUR region is like the Upper Rhine area, Switzerland, France, Germany. When we connect that to memory, is remembrance better done nationally or regionally?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I find that the regional scale is very, very rich. When I teach, sometimes students ask, how people deal with borders in Africa, because they say the borders in Africa are completely artificial. And I say to them, well, do you think that the Rhine is a natural border? Of course, no, it isn't. And you see it very clearly, because here in Basel, for example, we have a lot of people from France who work here, but who speak perfect Dutch, and they speak Alsatian. Not to say the people from Baden-Württemberg will come here to work, obviously. And so I find that there is a much clearer sense of cultural proximity at the regional level than there would be at a state level. At a state level, if you take France, the Alsatians are regarded as some kind of anomaly. No one would ever say that officially. But if you take the regional level, you realize that actually this is a German-speaking region, as in dialectal German-speaking region. And that to me is makes it even more human in a way, because it shows the proximity, the cultural proximity amongst the people that live in 3 different countries. Of course, the memories are not easy, because there's been a lot of division. There's been a lot of infighting. I mean, Alsace-Lorraine were German for 48 years. I mean, think about what that means. Is if you were born in 1871, it took you being 48 years old under Germany, and suddenly you became French. Why? Did you understand what I'm saying? It's a long time. So the memories are not necessarily the simplest, but I feel that there's more, people understand each other more than if they were to speak to each other from Paris to Berlin to Bern. Yeah, absolutely.
And with colonial memory, do you think that could also be done regionally, despite the individual nations or nationalities' different histories?
You mean here?
Yes.
It's interesting. You see, I don't know, because I don't know whether the 3 countries have a similar relationship to their own colonialism. Obviously France, has the lion's share of the business of having colonized other people. Germany has lost their colonies, even though, as far as I'm concerned, Germany has had a different relationship to imperialism, because Germany has had a European relationship to imperialism as well. And then Switzerland, until recently, was not concerned by the business of being involved with colonialism. In 2009 or 8, was it? The Swiss Bundespräsidentin, the president of the Confederation, went to Benin, and then she was told about, the enslavement of people on the coast of Benin and how they were sent orphaned to the ships, etc., to the Americas. And her public reaction was to say, I'm very glad to say that we, the Swiss, have nothing to do with this. I mean, that's not a century ago. Today we know it's not true, you see? So the point I'm trying to make is that people are at very different levels of consciousness around these questions, you know. So it might be, and of course, a lot of the Swiss looked at the French and said, these ones, they colonized. They are the bad ones, etc. So it may not be that obvious, you know, to bring them together.
And maybe not even a goal to aim for a unified culture of remembrance.
Well, if at least, you know, often the culture of remembrance in Germany is cited as an example, you know, the culture of remembrance of the Second World War, you know. In light of the events of the past few years, I wonder how people think about that culture of remembrance now. But that's another debate, although it's connected. So, you know, maybe that could be some sort of inspiration to the others. Because the French are not very good with remembering colonialism. You know, the trauma of the war of Algeria is very present still. And then France still has Département d'Outre-mer, you know, in the West Indies, if I were to use an old English term, you know, the Caribbean islands, in the Indian Ocean. So you have French citizens that are descendants of slaves. And I don't know that these people feel that they're really seen for what they are. So, you know, it's complicated.
Yes, it's complicated. Maybe that's a good final sentence for our questions. We've talked about practices of remembrance in Germany and Switzerland, at the Côte d'Ivoire. We've talked about the contents of this memory and then connected it maybe not that elegantly to the EPICUR program and your employment at an EPICUR university. Is there anything you would like to add as this is the end of our interview?
No, I mean, I just wanted to thank you very much for creating the conditions of an interesting conversation. I hope this was of interest to you.
Very much so.
It was very interesting for me to also reflect upon these questions because, you know, until you're asked certain questions, you don't actually know the extent to which you think certain things, you know. So you gave me an opportunity to really reflect on that notion of the relationship to the memory of colonialism in my home country, which shows me how much it's not past. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.